my slide. Okay, next slide. There we go. So just a second to let you know that this presentation is brought to you by our OSU Land Steward program. So we have lots of different topics that we invite presenters to provide for our audience. And now we're doing it, thanks to the pandemic, we're doing it all on Zoom, which has pluses and minuses. So if you want to hear about upcoming classes and you don't already, go to our website, just search OSU Land Stewards, go to our website and click that join button. You'll find it on the front page and you'll get emails about upcoming classes. So we have upcoming soon. We have on Thursday, What Kind of Bird Is That? Introduction to Birding in Southern Oregon, and Geology of Southwest Oregon on November 5th. And in December, we'll have a mushroom cultivation class. At the end of our presentation, quick before, if you can stay to the end, we appreciate it. And right before we sign off, we'll post a poll that will kind of is the way we're handling evaluation of our classes. So please stay for a second to do that quick three question poll at the end so we can see how we're doing getting you what you're interested in. So that's the end of my introductions of just kind of the program. And with that, I'm going to turn it over here in a second to Vanessa Robertson Rojas, who's a botanist and ecologist and private land stewardship coordinator for the Understory Initiative. So we think we're also going to have Kathryn Prive and Sean Prive, who are the leaders of the Understory Initiative, and Kathryn is also with the Rogue Native Plant Partnership, organizes the Rogue Native Plant Partnership, and those are both just really fabulous organizations. If you are into native plants, Google those things and look into them. And for personal reasons, those guys couldn't make it here tonight. We didn't want to postpone again, so Vanessa, who's very capable and works with the Understory Initiative, is going to give us the presentation that these guys have put together for us. So with that, I will turn it over to Vanessa. Vanessa, are you ready? I'll stop sharing. Did I stop? I think I did.
Can you folks hear me?
Yes, I can. So I think
okay, I'm going to go to my sharing screen. I'm going to mute my video so there's, minimizing as little of the bandwidth as possible. And I will just start talking.
So I am seeing the no, wait, hold on. I don't know what I'm seeing. There we go. Okay, perfect. Good. Looks good.
Yeah, I think it takes just a sec to get all the things clicked to get all the other things out of the way. Okay, so thank you so much, Rachel and Jamie in the Land Steward program for having me join for this talk last minute. Kathryn and Sean weren't able to attend, so we're happy to make sure this talk still happened. So I will just preface this talk that normally Kathryn and Sean give this talk. A lot of my work overlaps with the content, so I feel comfortable talking about it, but I definitely bring a different skill set and angle to the work that Sean and Kathryn do. I am an ecologist for the Understory Initiative. I actually worked for Kathryn like 3 years ago when Rogue Native Plant Partnership was starting. I also operate as the program coordinator for our private lands program. And we'll talk a little bit about these entities when we get to sort of the resources part of this presentation. So without further ado, lawn to meadow, using native plants to add pollinator habitat to your property. In the past, when Sean and Kathryn have given this talk, it's been a broader sort of how to manage property for native plants. And I think we're focusing specifically on lawns and transitions to meadow habitats using native plants to really hone in on what types of landscapes we are able to address. So, like I mentioned, I work for the Understory Initiative. We focus on understory plants and native plants in the Rogue Basin primarily. Our program does span from Klamath all the way to the coast. And we do work on a variety of projects. My program is one of just a few. Our overall mission is to facilitate restoration and conservation of native species habitat through partnership and community engagement, which is kind of a mouthful. I think it's just really important to understand that we're very much a collaborative entity seeking to bring native plants back onto the landscape in our region. The nature of nonprofit work really requires us to be, I would call us like task or shapeshifters in the work that we do, but our primary goal is restoring understory plant communities. Today, we're going to talk just specifically about why you would want to work with native plants, how you would prepare your site, what kind of plant material options we might have in this region. We'll walk you through some example species and then introduce you to some of the local working groups that offer aid. And I think this last bit, again, addresses the collaborative nature of this work. That I'm sure if anybody has sought native plants in this region before, you might have noticed that it's kind of hard to get native plant materials. And so people are trying to piecemeal together efforts to be supportive in any way for native plants. And that work can be really variable. So the local working groups offer a variety of different approaches, which is pretty great for our region. So yeah, to get started, why would you be interested in native plants? Now it sort of makes an intuitive sense that because they're adapted to this region, you might find native plants to take better to some of our climatic conditions. If you've ever looked at your lawn in like September and it's just a gray field, there might be some native plants that can augment some of that late summer season, dormant season, yellow and grayness. As pictured here is some of the Asclepia, the showy milkweed that is a much later species. I also think it's important to note that in terms of augmenting seasonal like spread, to get a good spread of plants persisting on the landscape throughout our entire year, a lot of the native plants in the Rogue Basin to me have really stood out as providing this early bloom and color in our region that is just really exceptional. So the plants that we work with are adapted to local conditions, and I think that it really can span a broad calendar year. One thing people are probably aware of is the loss of natural habitat for native plants. And we are encouraging people to work with these species to offer and to offset some of that loss of natural habitat. As a person who lives in an agricultural place, it does feel really good to feel like I'm offsetting some of the habitat loss that these communities experience, even in small amounts. Increased connectivity of small patches in between wildlands is a tremendous asset to the plant's dispersal and pollinator dispersal within our region. So that augmenting the loss of natural habitat is not like a futile cause. These plants also support native birds and pollinators, along with the increased pollination services those creatures bring into our landscape. I think some of the greatest satisfaction I have gotten from working with these plants is after they are brought back into a landscape, hearing the ruckus that comes with it, the songbirds and the buzz of pollinators using these plants is quite valuable. Specifically in our region and Northern California down to the California extent of monarch habitat, we have seen really, this graph shows over here on the, if you're looking at the screen, the left-hand side, 2017, 2018 numbers, and we are just seeing the steepest drop in these populations and their migratory patterns in the Pacific Northwest, but primarily Southwestern Oregon and California. These numbers are borderline endangered species listing. So when we think about providing habitat for species in decline, it's really fruitful to think of our lawns as potentially connective patchworks of habitat for pollinator species that could go extinct in our lifetime. So the monarchs have been a species of concern for the last 5-10 years. The Western bumblebee has also seen similarly devastating decline in the past 2 decades. And a lot of this decline is attributed to habitat loss. There's a combination of pesticides, parasites, climate change impacts, but habitat loss is one of the bigger and more quantifiable variables that affect these populations. The monarch skipper has also been in decline for the last 2 decades, 40%, so it's not 90% of the populations. However, it is largely under monitored as a species of concern. So that number could be higher than we understand. This species, because it's less studied, the literature is a little more depauperate. We don't know exactly what the reasons of decline are, but it is suspected that lack of habitat connectivity, use of pesticides, overgrazing of grasslands and invasive species are likely causes. And this species is a good example of connectivity being an impact that landowners, I think, can really augment in both urban and rural places. Providing a patchwork of connectivity is a special habitat function. It's not just about providing large tracts of habitat. We also need to consider habitat connectivity where these insects and animals are trying to transverse urban rural gradients. And as landowners, I think there's a specific place here for connectivity increase in the way that we support plants in our homes, in our places. So this plant is, or this insect is particularly in need of bunch grasses as a larval host. So we talk about plants providing floral resources in their nectar through their various floral structures, but it's also important to consider the lifespan needs of a given population. And it's interesting to think about larval hosts not necessarily being so dependent on a floral resource, but being more dependent on the structure of a bunch grass and perhaps the blade shape or the tuftiness of a bunch grass that might offer us some shelter for the larval stage. Also, I mean, I guess for all the botanists in here, the intrinsic value of species and their habitats can be really profound. Our region, our bioregion, is one of the most biodiverse and endemically supportive regions in the world. It's considered a hotspot and somewhat of a land bridge because the Klamath-Siskiyou landforms form an east-west connectivity that the Cascades don't really provide in their north-south orientation. And so our region is just this incredible place for a myriad of plant forms and unique species within families and genera that don't exist in any other place in the world. And so that intrinsic value, as a botanist, I of course can't share that joy enough with people. But from working with native plants in my own dwellings and homes within the Rogue Basin, it's just a value that's kind of irreplaceable. Additionally, these plants look good. Like I mentioned, there's a variety of growth forms in our region that don't exist in other places. These plants are so specially adapted to drought and serpentine soils that we have some of the most floristically diverse looking populations in our region, and they are beautiful. We do have this great assemblage of plants that blossom from early spring until later in the season, and the aesthetic value of those plants is pretty remarkable. So this sort of brings us to the how of our talk. When we're considering changing a lawn into a meadow, I think it kind of behooves us to talk about what a meadow is or could be. It's traditionally defined as, you know, a level, low-lying, open area that's dominated by both grass and wildflowers. And I think in our region, we see a lot more of these matrices where it's, you know, maybe a meadow with some transitional oak habitat or pine habitat nearby, or it's transitioning to a riparian area because it's low-lying and drains into a water body. So while a meadow is typically an open space dominated by both grass and wildflowers, in our region, we see sort of a complex expression of what that habitat type can really be. And again, I think that's a unique thing about the Siskiyou-Klamath bioregion, is that we have such variable topography and such ancient mountain formations that we often see meadows in strange elevations and at more than a steep grade than you would typically see in like what I'm like looked in the Merriam-Webster definition of a low sloped meadow. So I think the meadow species in our region are especially adapted to a variety of landforms, which is pretty special and helpful to our work. So moving into the how of what this transition could look like, there are two main steps that I think landowners should really consider in depth before making any moves on the ground. And the first is assessing your ecological conditions in order to determine which plants you would like to bring on to your landscape. Looking at your soil type, your sun exposure. Do you have water? Do you have a neighboring area that drains onto your land? Does your soil seem like it's been heavily disturbed for decades and just drains and dries? Is there any other vegetation present that might impact the work that you do or be impacted? And all of this can paint a picture primarily of what kind of ecosystem you might be within. Are you on one end of the urban spectrum or really dealing with a transitional wildland? Perhaps you have some bordering BLM land near you. All of these considerations can really give you a good context for what kind of land type you are frameworking your species mix for. And the second important step to consider thoroughly is how you plan to control non-native vegetation and open ground. And this is the most difficult step. I think there are a variety of really successful invasive plants in this region in the Pacific Northwest. And just from thinking about how the lineage of land disturbance has played out in our region for a long time, learning that perhaps, you know, blackberries were planted intentionally and cultivated and propagated intentionally as borders to rural spaces or ways to buffer riverine areas, gives me a more in-depth understanding of how intensely our natural areas have been disturbed. And those disturbances really perpetuate non-native vegetation in a lot of cases. So getting a good handle on which species you have and how their life expressions play out in their coverage of the landscape is super important. And so through this talk, we're going to talk about a variety of techniques for addressing these plant coverages. Any one of these is less successful on its own. We encourage synergizing some of these steps together. And some things are not really applicable. Say you have an ethical reason for not using herbicide or a logistical or pragmatic reason for not being able to do a controlled burn in your front yard. Does often weed out which techniques are not applicable. So you can do a mechanical or a manual removal. This is just like physically removing vegetative mass from your landscape. in a variety of ways. This can play out in a variety of ways. You can have a really high tech or a really low tech approach to that. It's sort of dependent on your own resources and ways of working with your own place. Controlled burning is a way to mimic a natural disturbance that is historically been very much an active part of our landscape. Some meadows in this region are theorized to burn every 3 to 5 years or 8 to 10 years, which is pretty frequently as compared to how meadows burn now. But again, this is maybe one of those techniques that is not super applicable in your front yard, really close to your living structure or near any kind of fuel area. Smothering and solarizing with tarps is a technique that seems to work really well with killing some of the below ground biomass if you deprive it of well, above ground and below ground biomass, but it's one way to target energy stores. When you deprive the plant target species of its photosynthetic system by blocking sunlight, or in the case of solarizing, you don't really, it doesn't have to remove the sunlight option. It just kind of heats up the plants below your solarizing tarp to where the biomass below ground is essentially like microwaved, or just the heat gets magnified and it kills the plant above ground and below ground. So these are like surface intervention techniques that interrupt the plant's life cycle. And as a last resort, people use herbicide from time to time. It often operates like a very short solution to a more long-term problem. A lot of people have ethical reasons to not apply herbicide, health reasons. In some cases with herbicides, there are licensing and like access barriers. We just generally promote herbicide as a last resort, especially in places that are near dwellings and might be places you want to spend time physically. So within our own work in the understory, you can see in this image, we're doing a vegetation plot that has a couple of transects, and our botany tech Kyle here is looking at some plants after we applied a mixture of these techniques. And we have listed, I think, raking and seeding as additional techniques in this slide because it was part of our design. We are setting up these test plots to learn more about how these techniques interact when you are combining them in different scenarios. And so in this case, there was some raking and divoting and seeding of native plants, and the divots were really successful in capturing surface flow and bringing the seeds into a concentrated area. And the raking did allow for thatch removal of Medusa head rye. And this is just an example of some of the work that we've done to learn about how these combinations work in a particular ecosystem. And you can see this is kind of what I'm talking about with the open meadow and a transitional oak savanna in the background that offers some kind of transitional area. And I'm working here with our other ecologist, Henry Woodridge. So the recommended process in a lawn area that we sort of recommend for people is definitely to find some technique to first remove the above ground vegetative mass. In an open grassy area, this could be mowing, it could be raking after the grass dries for the season. It could be a variety of vegetation removal techniques, and this just starts the cutoff process of the plant's life cycle. If you remove the vegetation and the photosynthetic parts of the plant from the system, you're starting to deplete that plant's ability to persist on the landscape. And here's Sean Prive. I think that's Sean. Maybe it's Henry, but it's someone weed whacking a huge plot. So you can scale up or scale down in terms of technology that you use, or the type of effort that you'd like to make in order to remove the vegetation. Mowing is just one way to start that process. We then suggest tarping an area if possible. I understand this can be a limiting factor and people might have ethical barriers to using plastic on the landscape. There are different techniques that offer the same function of basically adding another layer of removing the photosynthetic capacity of the non-native infested plants from an area. These are black tarps that are a couple millimeters thick. You can see there are some anchor bags on there. And this is a plot we did at Vesper Meadows through our private lands program with Janine Moy and a couple of our staff. And I think Brian Geyer was also here working on this project. This stage has proven to really smother and kill persistent pasture grasses without having to nuke the place with herbicides, which is a huge interest of ours, is to learn how to operate outside of herbicides. So you can see here that pulling a tarp out over this huge area can be, expensive and a labor upfront. But if you leave this out for 2 months, it really does seem to have a strong impact in smothering pasture grasses. The one we're looking at here is meadow foxtail or Aloepicura pratensis. That is just a really strong competitor for space as far as grasses go. It's a non-native pasture grass that people seed in for cattle. So you can pull the tarp off and then till to further disrupt some of the surface and below and like near surface storage areas. Here's Sean, I think, tilling his whole front yard with a rototiller that can also be a bunch of work. And if you're dealing with a lawn scale project, it makes sense to spend a day or two tilling. If you are dealing with 50 acres of pasture, it might not be the most effective way to disrupt that photosynthesis and below ground storage that a lot of non-native plants are really successful at using to compete for space. But on a smaller scale, this can be quite effective and helpful. It does create a surface disturbance that can release more seeds that were stored in the soil profile. So you might expect a flush after this and then re-put your tarp back over the tilled area to, after a few days, let some things germinate and then apply the tarp. After tilling, yeah, here we are, reapplying a tarp after tilling at the OSU Extension Center. I believe that's Lilia and Kathryn preparing another plot we worked on. And you can see they're just sort of unfolding the tarp there. And you can leave it for a while and then remove and water to get more seeds to germinate again. Here's Kathryn. I'm sure she feels really happy after retarping this giant area. You can see that there's some water down in the front and the anchor bags are set out to hold the tarp in place over a rather large plot that we're using to grow some native seeds. So these are there's some steps to adding a tarp and removing it and adding it. And in this way, you're really using the tarp to exhaust the seed bank and smother plants that are already well established in an area. And then after removing the tarp and watering, you replace it again and can leave it for another month or so to really smother those plants. And so this tarping, removing and tilling, tarping, removing and watering, tarping, really requires a planned timeline within a given season. It's not something that you can complete in a month, really. You could, of course, tarp for a month and then pull it, but this adding and removing technique really exhausts the non-native infestations and is most effective when you start this earlier in the season so that you really are exhausting those plants over many months or even years in some cases. So then we recommend removing the tarp and mulching the surface. So this further creates a layer in between any seeds in the seed bank that might still be on the surface and their ability to germinate from the sun. And you can see here a great example of a mulch layer that Sean and Kathryn applied just in their yard and seeded camas directly on top of the mulch. And the seeds germinated and were able to work down through the mulch to root, and they took off really well. So adding the mulch layer and seeding on top is an effective way to really select for the plants that you have chosen to plant. And I like to call this, then you call the seed mobile, people. This is Kathryn and Sean's car, just packed full of likely some grass seed. And that's when you bring in the seed, ideally. And we'll talk a little bit later about where you can source some of the plant material to then add to your landscape after you've pre-treated to remove non-native plants. This is an example of some hand seeding that Sean and Lilia are doing in the AFR project area. It's a good example of how lowbrow seeding can be. Hand seeding is a really effective way to distribute seed across the landscape if you are able to weigh out however much seed needs to be in your mix to cover your spatial area. And so Lily is scattering seed by hand after having weighed out however much we deemed necessary for this area. And then Sean is hand raking to sort of increase the contact of that seed. And you can see he's disturbing that upper layer of mulch just a little bit. And that is another sort of subjective part of this technique that, if you lay a thick layer of mulch, you have more wiggle room to increase the seed contact with the soil, or the mulch in that case. And it's a good technique to encourage germination. And then you water if you would like to water your area. A lot of these plants are adapted to our arid climate. But as you can see, in a domestic area, sometimes it's just nice to water if you have access to that, to really secure that population's first year of growth, especially their reproduction time of the year. So if you deem it necessary, watering is an option. Continued weeding always seems to be a part of the maintenance of these native reintroductions into our landscapes. These weeds are weeds for a reason. They're super persistent. They're really successful at just, having a couple blossom the first year, and then by year 3 or 5, they are invading the system again. So I think the part about considering long-term maintenance is really important when we're thinking about how long these systems have been disturbed in urban environments or agricultural environments or things sort of farther out on the wildland borders. If you put it into the timelines that our natural systems have been disturbed, having a 1 year set it and forget it kind of approach to managing for native plants just doesn't really work. And it's really important to adjust our frameworks to think about these plants as long-term investments into our landscapes. So here's some examples of some amazing plants that I think these are all from Sean and Kathryn's home that they were able to establish. On the far left is that camas that I showed you with the seeding directly on top of mulch example. In the center are some native stone crop plants, some sedums that are sort of, I guess in the botany world, kind of renowned for this area. We have so many amazing succulent species that live in steeper outcroppings, which I wouldn't apply to a meadow habitat, but it's kind of amazing that they are cultivatable. And then we have, of course, some beautiful wildflower mule's ears that are, once they establish, just beautiful additions to your landscape. It's sort of like the native sunflower, one version of a native sunflower, I guess, or something in the aster family. So there are a variety of strategies to consider when you're thinking about which species you want, including species that bloom throughout a growing season will increase your enjoyment of these plants in your world, and also span a broader calendar year of providing floral resources to pollinator species and just wildlife in general. So this example on the left here is a short spur sea blush, which is a pretty early season annual that establishes best from seed. It goes off, in March through June perhaps, and it's just a beautiful species to have on the landscape, but it really disappears as soon as late spring is drawing up in terms of precipitation. This species disappears, and if you were to plant a whole yard of sea blush, you might be kind of sad from May until the next March. So it's great to think about adding additional species like a showy milkweed that is a mid-season perennial. It does well with plugs. It develops this phenomenal taproot. We do offer some in seed through the program that I manage for private landowners. And this plant, so you can establish it in either way, but this plant is just like a tremendous pollinator resource. And it has this sort of ability to persist in the landscape as soon as things really heat up in our region. And it has these, incredible flowering adaptations, the waxiness, the color, small hairs to defend itself against drying out in our rather extreme summer climatic conditions. And then this aster, I think there's a lot of horticultural varieties that look just like this aster. This is a native aster that is a very late season perennial, and it does well from seed or plugs. It's super persistent on the landscape, and I mean, it's October, and the Understory was out collecting seeds, 3 days ago from this plant, and there was still a lot in flower. So just within these 3 plants, we were able to cover a calendar year from March until potentially November, which is a really broad range of providing floral resources for insects and birds, but also a person's own enjoyment in the landscape. So I think in our region, we definitely have a great variety of plants that span the calendar year. It's also important to consider layers. Our group focuses primarily on the herbaceous layer, or the, small grasses and wildflowers, but shrubs and trees are an important consideration to adding habitat complexity. And I think this is particularly interesting when thinking about getting sort of like I know Portland has like a certified bird habitat that often really promotes this different grouping complexity of plants. Oregon white oak is a great example of a tree that is often associated with a lot of plant form complexity. So there are a variety of shrubs that associate with this tree, and then you can see the balsam under the tree that seems to associate with sort of the oak savanna matrix. And this is Buddy, Kathryn and Sean's dog, who is a wonderful plant model. And in our area, this habitat type is very much threatened and in decline for a variety of environmental pressures. But again, habitat loss is a big one. And so considering shrubs and trees for complexity, but also for, adding a conservation augmentation to that is a valuable function. Black hawthorn is a small tree shrub that provides nectar resources and edible fruits. The edible fruit is a really great thing to consider when you're, again, offering resources for insects and animals across various life stages. It's wonderful to provide floral resources for pollinator species to receive nectar, and they all perpetuate pollination of your plants, but also providing berries and larval or nesting habitat is a great function to consider, and complex layers between shrubs, herbs, and trees really can span those lifespan support functions. Red flowering currant is a great shrub that provides early season pollinator habitat in the shrub form. Their berries are edible for birds, and they're also just so beautiful when you really have a robust plant producing these flowers early in the season after just gray winter for months and months. It is so delightful. One important thing to consider is grasses in your plant matrix. I know we're talking about converting lawns to meadows or pasture to meadows, and predominantly that means removing grasses from these landscapes. However, you can see here in this sort of special botanical area that is has these open meadows. That's sort of a pine matrix with open meadow. It's primarily grass dominated. Grasses provide so much function for covering spatial area and continuing to outcompete those non-native plants that you will have worked so hard to remove from your landscape. Replacing them with long-lived grasses is kind of essential in our region. These grasses can be decades long-lived and form these often beautiful tufts that have spaces in between that are often occupied by wildflowers. As you can kind of see in the bottom of this image over here, there's some white wildflowers in here. And just knowing this site, you know, it could be a variety of plants that occupy that interspatial area between these tufts. And so it's pretty essential in this region, and these plants really do offer great support for pollinators, as well as the wildflowers can provide, for pollinators. Romer's fescue is a great example of a really hardy bunch grass that's very aesthetically pleasing. It takes well from seed. It's a perennial bunch grass that hosts the Mardon skipper in the larval phase, like we mentioned earlier. This species is pretty common across a couple of different sort of savanna and meadow landscapes. So it has a lot of plasticity in the types of places it can inhabit. So getting Romer's fescue seed is quite useful across a variety of landscapes. After you've sort of assessed your situation, you might be surprised at the common grasses that can persist across these. Prairie June grass is a perennial bunch grass, and that's also common in oak and savanna areas and oak savanna areas. It's also really aesthetically pleasing. This plant is so beautiful. And again, it can be quite long-lived in this region. Large flower Collinsia is a good example of a prolific first year plant. So when I was talking about considering these projects on a timeline, it's also worth it to understand that certain populations boom and bust in the wild. And you might see a really prolific first year response, and then the plant kind of becomes a little sparse mixed in with all the other wildflowers, and then, you know, maybe has a bust again if there's some kind of disturbance. But if you're looking for a really good take your first year, so all of your hard work to remove your non-native plants isn't in vain, you might want to include some annuals or perennials that really take in your first years to occupy space. Wine cup clarkia is another example of a plant that can be quite like spanning in the habitat types that it will occupy and places it will proliferate, and also in its robust response in the first year 1, year 2 after seed sowing. It can hold ground, it will reseed itself and can be somewhat persistent, but this plant also has these sort of, booms and diminishes and booms again, or might reestablish in a new area as the seed drops nearby the parent plant. So seeds versus transplants are a really important element of your planting effort to consider. If you are more limited by money, seed is less expensive and allows for more diversity, especially in annuals. A lot of the annual seeds are much smaller, so it's easy to get a lot of seeds in a small amount of space and thus spend less money on it. But plugs offer the benefit of establishing more quickly because they've already been growing for a while. And this is a helpful thing to consider if you are looking to establish long-lived species and don't want to wait 5 to 8 years for them to start blossoming. Some of the native species are very long-lived, and so they're, for lack of a better term, their juvenile life stage is much longer lived than in an annual plant that might occur in the first 2 months, versus for like a species of Lomatium, it might occur in 3 to even 8 years. So having a transplant plug that has been in a nursery cultivation for several years could really speed that up. And it could be helpful to buy a mixture of seeds and plugs to achieve whatever goals you are seeking for your landscape. And on the left, this is what a Lomatium seed looks like. And here's sort of a plug example of that. So yeah, we recommend using both if possible, if you can find the species you're looking for in the stages and forms that you can find in your region. So resources for technical and financial assistance. So you've gone through and you've assessed your land and what kind of habitat you might have. You've done all this work to prep your site, and now you're ready to start developing or putting seeds out on your landscape. These are some entities that offer help in these areas in some capacity. And it really, it is important to start this research and seeking these plant materials before your planting season. So the Rogue Native Plant Partnership mission is to facilitate diverse, resilient ecosystems in tandem with a more robust native plant materials economy in the Rogue Basin. By taking on many challenges of native plant procurement processes. Basically, the Rogue Native Plant Partnerships operates as a facilitator and a collective partnership. They seek to bring together growers and practitioners, landowners, seed collectors into a common conversation where we can more effectively disseminate native plant materials from and in the Rogue Basin. You can see that this partnership is huge. Our bioregion is rather large and also super diverse in the type of work going on here and the type of plant materials being produced. I wouldn't say that the type of plant materials being produced is just through the roof excessive, but I would say that people do a diverse bit of plant material production for various entities. So there's private, non-government, federal, and then state and tribal partners that all do different work, which is, kind of amazing to look at this list. In the bottom right, you can see the roguenativeplants.org website, just in case you want to learn more about the partners and this broader collaborative effort. So the partnership has identified needs in the Rogue Basin by talking to our partners and talking to a variety of practitioners over the last several years. And we're seeking to operate as a resource sharing entity among groups working on similar projects or sharing similar plants. There's a great diversity of locally sourced species for use in riparian oak savanna restoration. So we want the diversity to increase. Like I mentioned, the projects and work that people are doing is quite diverse, but we need a greater diversity of locally sourced species. We just want to support more local native seed and plant producers, coordinate seed collection amongst groups. It's really important not to over collect from certain areas and certain populations, and not to duplicate efforts or to share knowledge of where a good place to collect might be. And then RNPP provides basin-wide guidance on seed propagule transfer seed zone, parentheses seed zones. Part of the collective aspect of RNPP is to collectively discuss and provide information about sort of best practices, and basin-wide guidance on seed zones is a really important part of the conversation. And some of the species we work with haven't been cultivated before, and so developing that body of knowledge is of great interest to all of our partners and our respective entities. So RNPP has an online resource library that has a ton of helpful documents. This is a place where I would specifically direct landowners who are seeking a variety of subjects, and you can download PDFs from the site and read things and sort of just, I just enjoy looking through the resource library for new areas of study and things that I haven't really dove into before. There's also a web soil survey. I guess these are some examples of things you can do within the resource library. A web soil survey could be really helpful early on in your development if you wanted to make a soil map of your area and just kind of read the soil descriptions that are, in your area. If you have like a domestic lawn, you might get one soil type, and reading that soil type and its description could be super informative to the way water drains on your site, to the type of minerals and components of your soil that you're working with. And it could be very informative to long-term planning. The propagation protocols we provide on the resource library, because we also work with growers and people who are propagating native plants. It's included in this talk in case somebody was thinking about propagating their own plugs. So if you wanted to really develop some plugs for 2 years down the road, and you're gonna tarp your lawn or meadow area in 2 years, you might want to get started on the plugs now. So there's a propagation protocol on the resource library. There's a yellow star thistle management guide on there. That's a pretty great document to get an idea of how this species proliferates on the landscape and ways that people manage star thistle. This one is a particularly problematic species in our area, but it's not the only guide that we have a species-specific approach to. Obviously, a guide for restoring and managing white oak habitat is a pretty pervasive habitat type that is in matrix with meadow areas. So having a handle on what an oak habitat might look like, and restoring and managing for this habitat, and some of the functions that oak savannas offer, is definitely a great thing to be up to speed on in this region. RNPP also hosts online native plant and seed sales in the spring and in the fall. This is important to point out that in the spring, it's primarily a plant sale, and in the fall, it's primarily a seed sale. And these aren't materials that RNPP cultivated themselves. Like I mentioned before, RNPP is a partnership that brings together growers and practitioners, and mostly the plant sale and the seed sales are a place to bring together excess wholesale plants and seeds that are then made available for like smaller scale retail. And normally these nursery owners and seed producers wouldn't want to sell a bunch of tiny orders. And so RNPP comes together to facilitate that exchange in a plant sale, usually in April or May, and a fall sale. I think ours happened this year in September and was extended during the fires just because chaos was erupting in all of everyone's lives. And the seed sale does require a restoration plan, and we are happy to talk to people about what that means and how to produce one of those in order to participate in that sale. It's every year we are able to procure a greater variety of native plants available. What is sold is also really influential over what will be provided again the next year. So it's important to throw your 2 cents out of this plant did really well on my landscape. I would like to purchase more, but it's not available. Can we make this more available? So yeah, those are that is a great resource for getting a variety of plant materials planning into the future for your projects. On the roadnativeplants.org website, you can find a contact form to get on the emailing list. And Kathryn is really on it with announcing things and providing all of the guidance for the public to access these sales. So and at the end of this talk, I think I'll put Kathryn's email up again and Sean's, and you can contact that way. There's also a lot of volunteer events, and this is a great way to get familiar with the plants that you might be working with. And also us as an entity, RNPP or the Understory. There's wild seed collection events, seed cleaning, restoration projects, and planting. And these happen all year. I mean, due to COVID, we've had to make some adjustments for how we operate in these events, but primarily they're outside. We cap the participation number and practice, mask wearing and social distancing. It's easier to meet those safety precautions when you're outside and in a large open area. So there are public meetings in the spring or fall. You can also get those updates from the emailing list or attend a volunteer event. You can also get information from the website about what type of events you'd like to engage with to be involved with RNPP. So the Southwest Oregon Pollinator Collaborative, or SWOPIC is how you pronounce that acronym, is another collection of partners that are government, agencies, nonprofits, and pollinator advocacy groups. This is specifically sort of like a pollinator group. It's a collaborative that is trying to come together to inform pollinator work on a landscape scale within the road basin. And it strategizes these efforts to support native plant and pollinator habitat in addition to considering the pollinators themselves. So this is a group that the Understory Initiative works with our partners to manage and perpetuate on behalf of the pollinators in our area. And the Understory Initiative.org is where you can find the SWOPIC group. And we're just looking to build more and more momentum for pollinator work in this area. And part of that is includes a private lands program that seeks to help people get seed material onto their land to seed pollinator species specifically. So it's kind of a new program that I just mentioned. It assists private landowners with pollinator habitat creation and restoration. And part of that is providing some technical support. So if you find yourself in the Web Soil Survey website and you don't remember which was the right button to click, part of our job is to help people navigate some of that planning complexity. and online resources. We do some free site visits and restoration planning. There's potential for financial assistance through providing seed stock and some of the seeding effort. And it depends on site prioritization and like a goodness of fit with our program goals and what our objectives are and the type of lands we can work on. And really, the overall scale and nature of a given area. Okay, 7 o'clock on the dot. This talk, of course, was originally put together by Sean Prive and Kathryn Prive. Their contact is here in these slides. In terms of contacting the Private Lands Program for help with pollinator habitat, you can just search for my program on the Understory Initiative website. And I believe my email is up front and center there. I'm gonna end screen sharing. Rachel, if you want to start facilitating some of the questions.
Okay, yeah, I was muted there, sorry. I think that Sean just joined us, and so I'm gonna try unmuting him. I mean, it just says Sean, so I'm assuming that's Sean Prive. Oops, let's see here. Okay, but I will just start kind of reading through the questions, and I was sort of reading them as they were coming in, so I'll try to kind of thread them for us. Oh, there's Sean. Hi. Great. So either of you guys just chime in if you have answers to these. So let's see. Let me just kind of go down because there's kind of chats in there too. Okay. So first of all, I wanted to clarify to the folks that were asking, we'll provide a video. It'll be a video recording of what you're experiencing here. So if you didn't have sound, there will be sound, and there's also a text kind of dialogue of the chat on the side. So that'll be in there as well. Okay, getting through kind of. So there was one question about when you said when you were tarping, it was microwaving, and I thought of just like nuking, it was just kind of.
So I should specify that solarization is just different from tarping. When you apply a light-proof tarp to the top of a soil profile, you're depriving a plant underneath it of light. When you're solarizing, you might be using a clear material that allows solar energy and magnifies solar energy through the tarp, and that heat functionally kills a plant. And so you're not like creating any kind of microwave at all. It is
cooking them with heat. I think it's a metaphor
you're
for
really
cooking.
heating it and like solarizing the plant material. Sorry, I was thinking about that as I was talking, like, what is the audience and their familiarity with this?
That's what I figured. It's just like saying nuke for applying herbicides, right? We're not really going to nuke them.
Nope.
Okay, there were questions about where to get those large tarps and what exactly they were, and also stakes. Do you have recommendations for those kinds of materials?
Staking tarps, when I think about, okay, first, our program has used, I think, farmersfriend.com or Friendly Farmer. For tarps, they're pretty affordable on a smaller scale. I mean, most things are more affordable on a smaller scale, but you know, a 24 by 100 foot, 24 foot by 105 foot tarp might be, you know, $150 or something, which is still, you know, a decent amount of money, but it's not thousands of dollars, and they might be a couple millimeters thick. And because you're investing in this material that is going to deal with some wear and tear from the elements, I wouldn't encourage staking it or putting holes in it unless you essentially need to, and it's a part of your long-term plan. Because once you put a hole in it, you can't really undo it, and it will start to wear after that puncture.
Okay. There was one comment further down talking about wind with the tarps if you didn't stake them.
So that's where the anchor bags are really helpful.
Okay.
It's a passive way to press the down.
Yeah.
It also increases the contact. If you're solarizing, it might be nice to increase contact by pressing it down instead of puncturing the thing.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
some people use just like beams of wood and lay them on top to hold them down, because with wind, you wouldn't want that to blow away after you spend all that time dragging it out in your habitat.
Right.
And so the anchor bags, you fill it with sand, cinch the top, and space them out 10 to 15 or maybe 20 feet apart, depending on how big the tarp is.
Okay.
You can also buy those from the website that I mentioned. Sorry, they're like an extra $20 or something.
Okay, which was Friendly Farmer or Farmer's
Yeah.
Friend?
I think it's Farmer's Friend. Sorry, I
Farmer's
always get
Friend.
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. So then there were questions about kind of the timing of tarping, more kind of specifically, and potentially seeding. I think that went down in there too.
So starting to plan a whole trajectory of a project that assesses a site and covers it and removes non-native plant material, and then includes seeding and some years of maintenance, can be, you know, a multi-year plan. And starting to develop that plan as soon as you are engaging with this project, of course, it's like the soonest you should start. If you were to lay out your tarps in the wintertime, you might prevent plants from germinating and watering. So spring, early spring is kind of a staple time to start. If you have the ability to start early in the season and then do the back and forth with pulling it off and tilling and putting it back on and then the pulling it off again, to allow the expression of multiple waves of non-native plants, you know, could essentially spend 6 months doing that and then sow in the fall. One thing I didn't mention specifically, but really should highlight, is that a lot of our native plants do well with a fall seeding. If you have plugs, you can put them in earlier in the season if you have irrigation to support their root expansion into the landscape from a tiny little plug root. But if you have a seeding distribution, you want to do that sort of right before the rain year really is starting to go. You seed too early, you might have insect and bird predation on your seeds. And if you seed too late, you might be sort of shocking the seed into a really wet and cold situation. So November is a good time to seed. And prior to that, you might spend the grow season before applying and removing your tarp for the spring season and summer season. And then by fall, ideally, you can have your plants. So it could take an entire growth season to get your native plants, get your site prepared and your native plants in a position to be supported by a water year after you sow everything.
Right. So one good way to think about it is, if you're prioritizing natives, is to think of what's happening with our native plants. So they've flowered in the spring or summer, and then they're dropping their seeds kind of throughout that hot, dry period, but there's no water for germination. And so once the rains start, that's when they're going to start germinating. And if you're trying to be in a wildland situation, that's what you want to go with, kind of that similar kind of timing. And I think that clarified. There were questions about kind of why taking the tarp off and putting it on in the watering. And so that's really to get all those non-native seeds to germinate and exhaust hopefully the seed bed, right?
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that is, you know, maybe a little bit counter to what is like happening during the summer season, but it's a great way to maximize the tarping opportunities. So if you put it out in the spring and smother non-native plants and then remove it and expose some of the soil, and then you can express another flush of what's in the seed bank or in the root system, and then re-tarp it again until, you know, October 31 is when the Pacific Northwestern rain season starts. But lately it feels like it's shifting to November. So if you pull the tarp off by then and seed, you are putting seeds out in a time when they would naturally be germinating. So their biochemistry is aligned to the climatic conditions that are happening in the late fall or the fall time. And then, yeah, the removing and putting it back on sort of allows you to maximize the tarp by flushing as many non-native seeds as you can. And I'm looking it up. It is farmersfriend.com. Sorry.
Okay. One person concern, oh, I'm not, sorry about that. One of us is breaking up a little bit. Oh, says my internet connection is unstable. So my internet connection is unstable. I'm going to turn off my video here. Let's see. I'm not sure if you guys can hear me. Everybody's frozen. Jamie, I think I might be.
Yeah, we can hear you, Rachel. Your audio is clear. Or it was. I can't hear you now. Are you talking now? Well, I can go ahead and go to the chat if you want, Vanessa. I can see it too.
That sounds great, Jamie. Yeah, I'm pulling up the chat too right now.
Okay, perfect. Someone asked, how deep of plugs would you recommend is sufficient for our deep-rooted natives like lomatiums, since they go pretty deep?
So I think that is another logistical decision people end up making in response to financial barriers or parameters, I guess, and space. If you can house, seeds up on a rack that have those longer tubes, that's ideal, especially for lomatiums and other bulb or taproot forming species. Alliums are another great species in our region that really appreciate root development. So as deep as you can house while you're supporting them and watering them. I think there is an upper limit of what is practical to move out onto your landscape. So if you have 5 plugs and are moving them out into your lawn to plant them, that's not an incredible workload to move around. But if you have 100 plugs and you want to really, cover your landscape, thinking about transporting those and keeping them intact during that whole process is an important logistics decision to make. So assessing your own ability to handle a workload of a really heavy plug. There are lots of different types of containers, but I think for the longer lived and more long-term establishing plants that have significant below ground stores like bulbs or taproots. Milkweeds also are in that group. They have a really impressive taproot, and it's part of why they persist in the summer extremes. Those plant groups, genuses, I think do really well with the longer, narrower, maybe 2 to 4 inches by 8 to 12 inches in the racks. They'll still hit the container wall, and you'll watch them sort of air trim around the bottom of the plug. And you can up pot, but you can't down pot, which is just a helpful thing to keep in mind. Did you have a response to that, Sean? I see your video turning on.
Oh, yeah, we have grown lomatiums in those cones like you're describing. I think you hit the nail on the head. We've grown them in, I think, 5-inch deep cones, and they grew right out the bottom and extended down into the soil and just started growing deeper than that. So they would go deeper than 5 inches, but they grew fine. We took them out and put them in the ground, and they're healthy and happy. So the cone shape for sure. Same with any other taprooted thing. A lot of things in the aster family are that way too. So yeah, I think you were just right on.
Perfect. Someone was wondering too, when you're doing some of the tarping you had mentioned earlier, is there a danger in eliminating some possible native plants in that seed bank as well?
So in that first step where you're assessing your landscape, and then the second step of sort of assessing which plants are in your landscape, it is important to take note of native plants. There are a surprising amount of native plants in this region that operate like weeds and are commonly considered weeds. And while they might be weedy in their dominance in the landscape, they can be native plants. And knowing the life history of a given species is really helpful to determining if tarping is going to kill it. If it's an annual and you just need to clip the seed head and it's fine to tarp, or if it's something that you could, perhaps work around if you wanted to keep something like a balsam root. Might have a really expansive taproot system that is super long-lived and maybe not worth smothering. So there's some risk of that. And when you're assessing your vegetative community that's already there, just learning a little bit about the plants that are there and their life history specifically will give you an idea of what are appropriate techniques for managing the veg cover that you have.
Great. Thanks. Someone was wondering too, if you could explain the purpose of that watering step and the tarping step you had mentioned earlier.
The watering is specifically to express plants in the upper part of the soil profile that are being stored in the seed bank. If you have removed the vegetative cover, there might still be some seeds of other species that would germinate as soon as the fall rains come in. And it's just one more step to eliminate some of the non-native weed pressure. The plants that invade areas are often really prolific in seed production. They can lie dormant and they will stack up in the top bit of the soil profile. So watering and leaving it open for a week or so, and then retarping after maybe that seed coat gets broken and the plants start to germinate, will then kill those seeds. It depends again on which weed species you might have in that area. So if you have taken your sort of plant inventory prior to it and you know that you have some really quick germing species, you can determine how long to leave that open after watering.
Okay, wonderful. Someone had asked, it seems like the tarping was really interesting for folks and they learned a lot. There was a lot of questions about it. Someone wanted to know if they could rent tarps from anywhere that you know of.
I don't. Do you know anything about that, Sean? So I do have an interest in developing like a materials library through some of our resources where we lend things out to people. I think that's something that's really interesting. If there was an interest in that through our pollinator program or RNPP or something, that might be worth looking into. I'm curious what you think about that, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, we've already purchased a few and they supposedly last about 10 years. I know from experience that they get holes in them pretty easily, but they're also patchable. So I'm expecting that we get an inventory of them and then they move around every year. So I'm guessing after this year, maybe next year, we'll probably have extras. And if folks are interested in working with us on creating pollinator habitat, just check with us. We'll probably have them. And if we don't, we could probably buy a few more and spread them around. So definitely ask if you just want to use it once and it's got a 10-year lifespan, maybe ask us before you go buy one because we could probably just get you one.
That's awesome. That's really generous. Someone wanted to know, are the SWOPC resources for landowners with a larger amount of land primarily?
So the private lands program that does pollinator work sort of in alignment with SWOPIC's agenda is for a variety of landowners. It does have, we work with people that specifically are landowners, and we do have a limitation, an upper limitation of size due to like the amount of native seeds that we have, but working with a variety of parcel size is definitely within our purview. It's not just like huge areas. I think the program and our funding sources have some stipulations about what folks we can bring into the program, but I don't think we're super limited by size. I think the smaller size we'd want to work with is maybe 100 square feet or so. So yeah, if you had a 5 by 10 foot plot, it might be kind of hard for us to enter into an agreement.
I think we would like to work with some people who just are interested in converting a yard. And we're also interested in working with people who have larger acreages. And I don't think we're ready to seed a lot of acreage yet, like Vanessa was saying, but that's what we're working toward. And especially partnering with other restoration organizations, Lomacatsi and the Nature Conservancy, and folks who are probably working toward doing more prescribed burning. NRCS, Fish and Wildlife Service, I foresee more prescribed burning in the future in our area. And I think that'll be an opportunity for us to go in and do seeding on larger scales. So I'm thinking, 2, 3, 4 years from now, we'll be doing that. Right now, we would love to help people with just smaller areas, even lawns or small areas that they think would be appropriate on a larger property.
And to piggyback off of that, that kind of reminds me of sort of a unique type of landowner that might have an experimental mind. There are some species that we don't totally know how they respond to these treatments or how they work in a mix or in these, disturbed landscapes of great variety. So I think we also are interested in people who might be interested in seeding specific plots and taking information on them as time goes on on a reasonable scale, not like a master's thesis level of detail and data collection. But so there's kind of a variety of options that we have to work with people.
That's great. Someone was asking, do you recommend irrigation in the first year or two after planting?
I would say that is super species specific. If you had some species that were adapted to live in a super dry part of the year, watering them could actually be counterproductive. So applying a watering yes or no broad answer isn't really applicable. It really depends on the species that you're looking to promote and how they respond to water.
My experience has been like trees and shrubs and things like that you've spent some money on this particular plant and you want to make sure it gets through. You should water it and then taper off the water as you go along. But if you seed an area, especially that used to be lawn or it's like in an urban, really weedy area, and you seed it and you plant a few plugs, you should do bare minimum watering, if any at all. It tends to revert back to lawn if you water it. So our drought tolerant natives probably are going to be more competitive without watering.
Oh, that's interesting. Someone was asking, and Rachel had some really great suggestions for this question in the chat, but someone was wondering too if you all might have suggestions for books and resources you recommend for plant ID.
Sean.
Yeah, she mentioned the Jepson Manual. Flora of Oregon is still coming out. Those are technical guides. The Flowers of Table Rocks is fantastic and has a huge amount of information. I use all those sources. I also use CalFlora and CalPhotos and CalScape. Those are all California-based resources, but they're pretty applicable to our area. It's very rare that you find a plant here that you can't find in the California system. And they have a huge amount of information about the phenology of the plant, when it grows, when it flowers, the conditions it grows in, especially on CalScape. There aren't really keys, although you can access the Jepson Manual keys online if people are thinking they want to get technical and potentially even use a microscope or something to ID. It's hard just getting, I learned a lot getting Wildflowers of the Pacific Northwest, which I think is a Timber Press book, if I'm remembering correctly. It's fantastic for just site IDing wildflowers. And then I've been using iNaturalist lately, which helps you, you take a picture of a wildflower or something like that. If it's a more obscure thing or a grass or something like that, a lot of times it's not very accurate and is not that helpful. But if it's a pretty common thing and you get a good shot of the flower, it can ID it for you. So there's a lot of resources, and I always try and encourage people. We haven't gotten too much of this in the past, so we haven't had enough for me to regret saying this. But if you want to just have us out for a site visit, or even just want to email us a set of pictures, we'd be more than happy to help with plant ID. Now, if we get people flooding us with requests for that, we might have to start sifting through people whether or not we can do that. But we love IDing plants, so if you just want to send us pictures even, we'd be more than happy. And I happen to know that Rachel herself is an extremely good botanist. very talented, so she probably is a good resource.
I would also add that I use the Oregon Flora app that they developed after putting out the books. That one is really helpful for sorting by some really basic features for like perhaps a novice approach. INAT is super great. I think in a lot of ways that app can help if you're less familiar with things. Which one was the one that's color coded, Sean? The Wildflowers of the Pacific Northwest?
Yep.
I think that's also a great recommendation for people who aren't ready to key things out and get into scope work. I loved learning the groups by the arrangement of that book, if that's helpful to people.
Great. We only have about 3 minutes until 7:30, so maybe just 1 or 2 more questions.
Jamie, can I interrupt?
Yeah, you
Oh,
can
I'm not
take
sure if you're
over.
going to get to this one, but Denise asked a couple times, she wanted to address the question of when you're tilling, how that releases carbon from the soil and that being a concern with agriculture. And so how is that kind of, if you could kind of talk about in this kind of application, and if there's some other method that you might recommend. Although I wanted to insert that I think with agriculture, if you're doing it seasonally, that's different than the idea is that you're going to establish a long-term plant population, but go ahead.
I think, yeah, that is such a great consideration. I think tilling can release carbon, disturb the soil in a way that proliferates non-native plants that are adapted to that kind of disturbance. So it's really great to be thoughtful about how you choose to disrupt some of the plant matter above ground or near surface level. I've had some good luck with raking or harrowing or a much lighter removal of like that top veg layer or that top layer. I would say if you're really concerned about it on a big scale, consider, if you're looking at a 300-acre parcel or a 100-acre parcel or even 1 acre, and you don't want to release all that carbon and disturb all that soil and create perhaps a water-resistant layer, what have you, consider running a box grader over the surface or a chain attachment on the back where you can drag a harrow behind you, do some hand raking or something. I think it's a great consideration not to just immediately go to tilling because that's our sort of go-to in an agricultural practice. It is worth approaching tilling with trepidation and only doing it if you really feel like you need to disturb like a serious root system that's near the surface and which it will be affected towards. So some of your pasture grasses and lawn grasses might be a good example of that.
And if you have soil compaction, tilling might be necessary. But I agree. I consider it optional unless you have a lot of compaction. And I think you're right, Rachel, that the next step is you're going to grow a lot of native perennials and bunch grasses and things that store a lot more carbon than your lawn does. So hopefully you're moving toward something that stores carbon in the long run in a really positive way.
There were also a couple of questions in there about non-natives that are pollinator friendly. So kind of says many of, oh, wait a second, kind of says, I have non-native pollinator friendly plants in an area. Is it worth keeping the non-natives? And Scott Good was also mentioning that things like Veronica persicofolia and our lamiums, our spring lamiums, as ground covers. Could you talk a little bit about natives versus non-natives?
Yeah, so the whole reason that you might want to swap out some of those for native species is the broader ecology of what we're aiming for here. So if you have a lot of non-native plants, they might support non-native European honeybees or other invasive pests that have negative impacts on the ecosystem. You might have sort of like a disjointing of when their floral resource is available or whether or not their nectar is like adaptively nutritious to the native insects in our region. So you might have some ecological mismatching that happens between the non-native flowers and some of the species of concern around here. In some cases, though, I think people choose to keep non-native species, when you don't have other options, or it's a really hard area to seed, it's heavily disturbed, it might have some toxic stuff in the soil that you don't want to dig up, asphalt or something. And so there are, I think, a variety of reasons that people consider non-native plants staying around, but ideally you are trying to create some kind of support habitat for native species in the region. So I don't really think of non-native seeds as inherently need to get off the landscape and evil, but there are ecological considerations that native seeds provide, or native plants provide a function that they don't provide. And they're gonna stick around. they're not gonna ever be really removed from the landscape, it feels like. So
Right.
I think becoming familiar with who they are and what they do as plants for your habitat and ecosystem that you're considering is really important.
Okay, well, we are at 7:31 on my clock, and thank you so much, Jamie, for pinch hitting there when I dropped out on the internet, the fun times of Zoom. These guys are really very accessible. The Rogue Native Plant Partnership and the Understory Initiative are just doing wonderful, wonderful work, and it's really exciting for me to see so much interest in our community about this topic. So hopefully you'll have a chance to look at some of those resources. We will give you, I entered some of the things that they were mentioning into the chat. So that'll be in the chat when you get the recording and you access it through the YouTube. Thanks so much, Vanessa, for coming in the last minute. And thank you, Sean, for jumping in with us. And thank you, Jamie. And we're gonna put up a really quick poll. And so before you guys pop out of the meeting, if you would take a moment to take that poll, we'd really appreciate it. And we'll just kind of stay on the line quietly while we get some answers. I think, Jamie, right?
Yes, it should have just launched. Are you all seeing that on your end?
Yes, I'm seeing it.
Okay.
Okay, thanks so much, you guys. And you can just leave when you're done or when you're tired.
Thank you so much for having us, Rachel. Thank you again. And Jamie, thank you for your work.
Thank you both so much. And thanks for everyone who participated tonight.
Thank you, and thanks for being flexible with us.
Yeah.
Yeah, easy.